Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my own little opinion on this fight that, of course, ended up happening yesterday between that of a Lamont Roach Jr. versus Gervonta Davis. And I already kind of gave my opinion on the fight as of yesterday, but I thought that I would kind of deep dive at least a little bit more into the fight, at least talking a little bit more about what happened and on top of that, also about what this performance, in my personal view, means for that of a Gervonta Davis. And the reason why, in my view, this fight really meant so much is because Gervonta Davis, of course, the standards within him, or when we hold the standards with that of a Gervonta Davis, the standards are held very, very high because Gervonta Davis is supposed to be one of the top 10 on some people's list, top five pound for pound fighters in the world. Now, in my personal view, I don't think that he ever really got as close to the top five pound for pound spot. And this is a part of the reason why. A lot of my channel, you notice that, of course, I review videos by that of Dante's Boxing Nation or Boxing Ego or Aki TV or some of these other LDBC and new media channels, especially. And part of the reason why I like to do that is because Dante's Boxing Nation, for example, he would always complain about why certain people why they would have a problem with Gervonta Davis being top five pound for pound. And he would basically state that, oh, well, it's because that Gervonta Davis is a quote unquote black fighter. That black fighters, they're not allowed to support other black fighters. Well, is it really because they were mad because a black fighter was in the top five pound for pound? Or are they thinking that he was not really that deserving of it? Keep in mind that Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other guys, they're the same people that bitch, moan, and complain about when Lomachenko, Canelo, or Inoue or Usyk was ranked number one pound for pound, even at certain times when those guys had deserved it. For example, like right now, Alexander Usyk, in my view, he is the number one pound for pound fighter. Now, if you were to ask Dante's Boxing Nation or some of these other LDBC and new media channels, the reason why allegedly Usyk would be number one, in the world right now is because they don't want a black fighter like Crawford to be the number one pound for pound fighter. And listen, there are certain cases like that to where that is a relevant argument because, of course, certain black fighters, they do get treated with that of double standards. And, of course, they don't always get dealt the best cards, at least in terms of the proper criticism that is given to them. I do agree with that. But sometimes you have a lot of these channels like that of a Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV that end up pulling the race card just way, way, way too often and pretty much end up doing it because it's the most convenient argument that they really can use and they don't really have any other argument that is really super logical to the equation. It just is what it is. Well, Gervonta Davis, a big part of the reason why, in my view, he was never top five pound for pound, and right now, certainly after this performance, he cannot be top five pound for pound, is really because of a multitude of reasons. Gervonta Davis doesn't really have that deep of a resume. It just is what it is. The two biggest wins of his career have been over Ryan Garcia and also over that of a Frank Martin. Now, in my view, both of those guys are A grade level fighters. I think that they're A minus level fighters. But the problem is that how good are those guys actually? They've never won belts at any point in time given in their career. Of course, Ryan Garcia was recently able to defeat Devin Haney, but that win was just recently recalled, or it was called back because he was caught on that performance enhancing drugs. Now, do I also believe that Devin Haney might be on something because of the snack program? Yes, but at the end of the day, Ryan Garcia was caught on something. So it is what it is. And Frank Martin, of course, he seems like a very decent boxer. I would give him the level of A minus, but the thing still remains is that he's a guy that really has never won a belt before. And then when you take a look at a certain amount of the other wins, many Gervonta Davis fans or certain channels, they may try to tell you that, oh, well, Gervonta Davis, he's beaten this champion, he's beaten this champion, he's beaten this champion, right? But a lot of those guys, to be quite honest with you, like when you talk about Mario Barrios and Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Rolando Romero, none of those guys are real championship caliber level fighters. And that's why none of them ever lasted very long with that of the belt. Because when you take a look at that of a Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he ended up winning it over Rolly Romero, a guy that really does not know how to box to an elite level. He ended up beating the shit out of Rolly Romero and then losing it in the fight against Jose Valenzuela. And we all just seen what ended up happening to Jose Valenzuela against Gary Antoine Russell. He's not an A grade level boxer. He's a good boxer, but he's not an A grade level boxer. It just is what it is. Mario Barrios just had a draw in his last fight against a guy that really is not that known. And then on top of that, when you talk about that of a Rolly Romero, we all know what happened to him against Isaac Pitbull Cruz. So Al Heyman did some very genius matchmaking and had some of those fighters win titles in certain weight classes to where all those weight classes, if you notice it, all those weight classes were pretty much vacant of all the formal talent that they had. When you talk about Isaac Pitbull Cruz, he could have potentially fought Shakur Stevenson at 135. It didn't happen. Instead, he moved up to 140 to get a title shot, I believe, against Rolly Romero. And of course, Rolly Romero, he was basically given that title, in a questionable stoppage, I believe, against that older fighter, Barrasso, or whatever the hell his name was. I can't even personally remember. So once again, it's very clear that, there was a little bit of fabrication from that of Al Heyman. It just is what it is. And that's why when we take a look on the surface, for those of us that, overall, the sport of boxing, for those of us that actually know a little bit of the depth about the sport, you can't always just count every elite champion or every champion as an elite level fighter, because not every champion is an elite level fighter. Isaac Pitbull Cruz and Mario Barrios and Rolando Romero, none of those guys are A grade level fighters. They're just not. I don't care what the Gervonta Davis fans try to tell you. They're just not. Now, once again, I think that he's beaten a couple of A grade level fighters. He did end up beating that of a Ryan Garcia, and he did also end up beating that of a Frank Martin. But that being stated, especially with a certain amount of the channels and the videos that I have reviewed, for those of you that have ever went to Dante's Boxing Nation's channel and heard the standards that he has for, say, a Canelo Alvarez, and saying that Canelo, that he's quote unquote the most overrated fighter of all time, and that, well, we can't count his wins over Golovkin or Lara because they're quote unquote controversial, and then he gives you these narratives about how Canelo, he's a guy that loses the fight but then ends up winning by knockout in the end. That's how limited of a fighter that he actually is. The fighter that he actually tries to make Canelo Alvarez sound with these narratives of Canelo Alvarez being the biggest cherry picker of all time, and with Canelo Alvarez being a quote unquote limited fighter, and a Canelo Alvarez someone that, ends up fighting guys that either have already suffered losses or are clearly not the best in their weight classes, or on top of that, he ends up losing a certain amount of the rounds but then winning by knockout. The fighter that actually he should be talking about in that light is Mr. Gervonta Davis. Because if we're actually going to put any labels on any particular fighter for a fighter that actually would live up to that name, it would be Gervonta Davis. And Gervonta Davis, I think, is a phenomenal talent, but after this performance, I have to put him lower on my pound for pound list. I have to even question if he really even deserves to be on my pound for pound list after this. Because, however people really want to cut it, the bottom line is that if this was Canelo Alvarez or Usyk, or if this was Crawford or someone like an Inoue or someone like that, if this was a fighter that was actually looked at as potential top 5 pound for pound and as one of the greatest fighters of their generation, they would have been absolutely ripped to shreds. And I mean, Gervonta Davis is being ripped to shreds right now because he's still held amongst very high standards. But could you imagine if Canelo Alvarez ended up losing or almost losing to a guy, even at this stage in his career, to where he's clearly older and not the same fighter anymore? Could you imagine if Canelo Alvarez ended up bringing someone up from the middleweight class, brought them up one weight class, overall ended up almost losing to a B grade level fighter? Could you imagine that? Like it would never happen. And that's why whenever you talk about some of these channels like Anaki TV and Dante's Boxing Nation, this is why I always like to say, these guys don't know anything about boxing. You have some of these guys that especially love to go along these narratives and say that Gervonta Davis, that he's a guy that's way more talented than Canelo or way more talented than some of these other guys. Gervonta Davis is not more talented and is not a more skilled fighter than Canelo. This situation would have never happened to Canelo Alvarez in the first place. Say whatever you want to about Canelo, especially with the loss to Floyd Mayweather Jr. and also that of a Dimitri Bivol. I've never seen a B grade level fighter against Canelo Alvarez almost beat him in a particular fight. I've never seen it happen. Never seen it happen. The fights that I've either almost seen Canelo Alvarez lose, or that were very tight, they were all against A grade level fighters. Whether you're talking about Danny Jacobs or Arizona Lara or Golovkin or Mayweather or Bivol, or possibly some other guys that I'm not thinking of. I mean, sure, he's had, maybe not so stellar performances against certain B grade level fighters like John Ryder, or maybe a James Kirkland, someone back in the day when, it was as competitive as what it was for how long it lasted. Sure, maybe even a little bit of an Amir Khan in the early part of the fight. But I mean, other than that, I've never seen a Canelo or a Crawford or a Usyk or an Inoue ever have this type of issue in their career. And it's not like Lamont Roach, in my view, is not a skilled fighter, but there was no way that a fighter that was moving up one weight class, a guy that had just recently won the belt, a guy overall to where he's not even fighting at the weight class that he naturally belonged at 130. Now, to be fair, it's not like Gervonta Davis is the biggest 135 pounder. One could debate that he's more of a 130 pounder. Both of these guys pretty much were the exact same size, in my personal view. But the thing is that Gervonta Davis, he was fighting a guy with 10 knockouts, I believe, out of 25 victories in his career. I'm not even quite sure if that is a 40% knockout percentage. So when you talk about it, Gervonta Davis, when it comes down to it, he was hurt multiple times against a guy that had 10 total knockouts in his career. Now, just because you have 10 total knockouts in your career doesn't always mean that you don't have a little bit more power, and it's obvious that Lamont Roach Jr., that he definitely has more power than what meets the eye. But even with that being stated, the power was never supposed to be as impactful in this fight as what it was in the first place, even with a little bit of the sneaky power of a Lamont Roach. And this is why I have to say there's no way possible that until Gervonta Davis, unless he gets in the ring with a Lomachenko or a Shakur Stevenson or a Teofimo Lopez or something like that, there's no way that I can ever have him on my top 5 pound for pound list at the moment, fighting these type of guys, number one, but then on top of that, having these type of performances. Like I said, at Dante's Boxing Nation and Aki TV, they love to give these criticisms to fighters like Canelo Alvarez for allegedly losing certain fights like to Billy Joe Saunders or Plant before the knockout ended up occurring. And of course, for any of us that know how to actually score a boxing fight, we all know that that's bullshit. But, once again, the narrative always is, especially about Canelo or some of these other fighters that they love to tear down, is that, oh, look how limited they are. Like, take a look at Canelo. Look how limited he is. He's a one-dimensional fighter. He can't make adjustments. I've seen Canelo Alvarez, say whatever you want about him, but the man is 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach. And on top of that, I've seen Canelo Alvarez adjust to a multitude of styles, whether it be Billy Joe Saunders or whether it be Caleb Plant, whether it be Danny Jacobs, whether it be that of a Sergey the Crusher Kovalev or a Gennady Golovkin, even to a slight degree Ersani Lara. To be quite honest with you, Gervonta Davis had no adjustments really within this fight. He didn't really have that great of adjustments. I mean, he was trying to use his lead hand to a degree, but it was nowhere near enough and it was nowhere near as effective. It was very clear that that lead hand and on top of that, that left hook by Lamont Roach Jr., it was giving Gervonta Davis fits. And he was trying to counter, but to be quite honest with you, there was not a whole lot of intelligent counters coming from that of a Gervonta Davis. It just is what it is. And once again, Lamont Roach Jr., very talented boxer. And after this fight, of course, is going to be looked at as an A-grade level fighter. But is Lamont Roach Jr. someone that is truly an A-grade level fighter? Or is he someone that gave a very tough fight to Gervonta Davis, someone that might have a little bit of a troubling style, overall, or a troubling time with this type of style? We still don't really know how good Lamont Roach Jr. is. Sometimes, there are certain fighters to where they end up giving that pound for pound talent a great fight, like what we've seen with Crawford and Israel Madrimov, and then Madrimov ends up losing to Virgil Ortiz. We don't know. A lot of people are assuming that, maybe Lamont Roach, maybe he can have a chance over Shakur Stevenson or certain guys like that. But I guarantee you that if he got in the ring with Shakur Stevenson next, then more than likely Shakur Stevenson would clearly beat him. I bet you money that if he more than likely got in the ring with Lomachenko, then Lomachenko would probably beat him. So the thing is that although I do believe that Lamont Roach is probably an A- level fighter, we don't completely know that. And this was never supposed to happen in the first place with a Gervonta Davis. It was never supposed to happen. So that being stated, although Gervonta Davis still, in my view, is a relatively great fighter, and I do think that he is a pound-for-pound guy and a pound-for-pound talent, this was a fight that, in my personal view, he probably should have lost, especially when you take a look and see what ended up happening on the screen here. I mean, I don't know what Steve Willis was doing. I think that it was very obvious that Al Heyman told Steve Willis that, listen, Gervonta Davis is the favorite. So at the end of the day, try to skew it in his favor to a little bit of a degree. Because listen, I don't give a shit what anybody says. I don't care how big of a Gervonta Davis fan you are. I don't give a shit. If you end up taking a knee in the middle of combat. It's not like it's at the beginning of the round. It's not like it's just at the end of the round or something like that. You were in the middle of combat. Lamont Roach throws a jab in your face, barely lands, of course, but then you end up taking a knee. Now, do I believe that Gervonta Davis more than likely ended up having something in his eyes? Yes. But you end up taking a knee. That is immediately supposed to be a knockdown. Steve Willis blew that call majorly. He had a terrible, terrible performance in this fight. And to be quite honest with you, I'm not really quite sure if he should be allowed to referee, overall a main fight ever again after this. It was one of the worst officiated fights that I had ever seen. I mean, he literally was on Gervonta Davis's payroll basically throughout the whole entire fight. And anytime things would not go Gervonta Davis's way, he would literally bitch to the referee in order to possibly skew something in his way. Very similar to that of a Bernard Hopkins during his career. But anyways, the thing is that although I do have a great amount of respect for Gervonta Davis, he's a great fighter, but it was not a great look yesterday. And to be honest with you, the reason why it may have not been that great of a look is because maybe many of us have been overrating Gervonta Davis. Maybe Gervonta Davis is not the talent, and maybe he's not someone that is as skilled or is as talented as what many people try to say that he is. Once again, a lot of people take a look at some of these fighters, especially from America, like Gervonta Davis or certain things like that. They take a look at their quicker feet, and they expect them to immediately be like Floyd Mayweather Jr. when they're not. And Gervonta Davis showed that not only is he not Floyd Mayweather Jr., but he's not Inoue, he's not Usyk, he's not Canelo, he's not Crawford. He's not any of those fighters for his particular generation. He's just not. He has a lot more proving to do. Now, just because this performance was a very bad performance and I thought that he lost, is it the end of the world? No, it's not. But in order for his career to be resurrected, in my view, at least to be compared to any of the great fighters, I mean, I can't even compare him to any of those guys because all those guys have done way more in their career than what a Gervonta Davis has done. But the thing is that at least the connotation is that Gervonta, even though he doesn't have the resume or the accomplishments of those guys, at least he can compete somewhat skillfully. At least some people thought that. I don't even think that he can compete skillfully with those guys. And honestly, the question was for me for such a long time with Gervonta Davis was that, is he really carrying some of his opponents, or is he really having a lot more problems than what I once originally thought? And it appears that we're starting to get our answer. Because to be quite honest with you, I thought that he lost a certain amount of rounds against Hector Garcia. I thought that he was losing the fight before he knocked out Frank Martin. I thought that he was losing the fight against Rolly Romero, at least by one round, before he ended up getting a knockout, or it was way too close for comfort. And to be honest with you, I thought that he should have lost this fight about 7-5 rounds. Now, I don't mind the draw necessarily, but that being stated, Steve Willis blew a major call within this fight. And to be honest with you, they might have to enter something into boxing to where they might have to change that to where if it's so clearly against the rules like that was, they might have to overall overturn that to where they can overturn the decision. Because it's no offense overall, but come on, you're not allowed to do that. I've never once seen a fight ever in my personal boxing tenure where the guy ended up taking a knee, no matter what the situation was, in the middle of combat, in the middle of a fight, and it was not counted as a knockdown. Never seen it. And I believe Terrence Bud Crawford said the same thing. Now, I've seen blown knockdowns. I've seen blown calls, when it comes down to it, certain, or, calls to where, it was called a knockdown and it was a very bad call. But I've never seen something like this. And once again, for the same people, for those of you that were going on and on about the alleged Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury corruption, this is actually what real corruption looks like. There's no way that Gervonta Davis, that was not supposed to be counted as a knockdown. He allowed Gervonta Davis to shoulder him directly in the face, and then at the end, the fight was scored a draw. Now, in my view, it's not necessarily bad that the fight was scored a draw. I can see a draw, but, let's be real. If there was a fighter that more than likely deserved to win the fight, in my view, it probably was Lamont Roach, in my personal view. And, a draw for Gervonta Davis is really a win because he still gets to keep his titles. And then on top of that, he has his career still intact. He still has that undefeated record. So once again, it just is what it is. But after this fight, Gervonta Davis, although people can talk about him allegedly being the Michael Jordan of the sport and all this other stuff, he needs to do a lot more proving than what a Usyk or Canelo or a Crawford or Inoue need to do. All those fighters have somewhat proved themselves in somewhat of ways. Now, of course, maybe some of them, like Inoue, could prove themselves in other certain ways. Of course, we need to see Inoue in the big fights against Nakatani and, Nick Ball and some of those other ones, maybe a Jesse Bam Bam Rodriguez. But at the end of the day, Inoue has still proved himself against a big fight against Stephon Fulton. He's a 4-weight division champion. And you could debate that he has a couple to a few A-grade level wins in his career. Gervonta has a couple of A-grade level wins, but if we're going to take a look at Gervonta Tank Davis's career, it's not a pound for pound level talent career. It's just not. It's not a pound for pound career. Or I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it's not a top 5 pound for pound career. That's really what I should be saying. But I just thought that I would state that because, I've been around boxing for many years now. I've heard narratives on all the fighters, whether it be Crawford, whether it be Mayweather or Canelo or Usyk. If this would have been one of them, they would have got absolutely tore to shreds. Like I said, Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV or one of these LDBC or new media channels, if this was Canelo yesterday that had fought Lamont Roach Jr., we would never hear the end of it. All we would hear about is that Canelo really should have lost, but the complexion for the protection, overall, there was a knockdown, but it wasn't called. Canelo was the most overrated fighter of all time. That's what we'd be hearing. But once again, that's why I say when certain people state all this stuff about Gervonta Tank Davis, being a greater talent than some of these guys, Gervonta is not a greater talent, at least overall so far as what has been proven. He's not a greater talent than Canelo. He's also not a greater talent than Usyk. He's not a greater talent than Crawford. And also he's not a greater talent than Inoue. At least skill for skill wise, it is what it is. He's a great athlete, but I think that he's got some solid skills, but he's gonna have to really prove himself, from this moment on. Because to be honest with you, this pretty much was a cherry pick gone wrong, to be quite honest with you. Or at least it was a fight that, almost nobody wanted to see. I'm not going to call it a complete cherry pick because, of course, Lomachenko pulled out of negotiations and certain things like that happened. But this was a terrible look for Gervonta Tank Davis. A fight that, in my view, he really lost. And in my view, if he is in the top 10, he's at the bottom too. It just is what it is. I don't think that there's any debate about it. But we'll see what ends up happening. I'll be rooting for Gervonta Tank Davis. I would still love to see him in the bigger fights. But to be honest with you, once again, we need to kind of slow our roll a little bit when we talk about a fighter like Gervonta Tank Davis being in the top 5 pound for pound. Now, I've never put him there, but many other people have. There's no way that in my view, especially after this performance, that you can ever put him in the top 5 pound for pound, at least until he beats guys like Shakur Stevenson and Lomachenko. No way in hell. This is what it is. All right, so that's just the bottom line of it. But once again, I wanted to talk about this because, many of the narratives that I see about Canelo or, some of these other fighters, especially from these LDBC and new media channels, the fighter that, for example, once again, that Dante tries to make Canelo Alvarez seem like, that's really Gervonta Tank Davis. Like a guy that oftentimes has to end up winning the fight because of his power and his knockouts. Canelo can actually win the fight even if he doesn't end up getting the knockout. A guy that has not fought really great level competition throughout his whole entire career and has avoided pretty much all the big names throughout his career, or at least for a certain amount of time. He hasn't really sounded super hot getting in the ring with Keyshawn Davis, nor Shakur Stevenson, nor Devin Haney, So, I mean, it's like, who do you really want to fight? And years ago when Lomachenko was at his peak, you didn't want to fight him. So, I mean, once again, the fighter that Dante is trying to make Canelo Alvarez seem, that's really Gervonta Tank Davis. Like he says that Canelo's this cherry picker. You can't be a cherry picker when you overall, and that's not me stating that Canelo has not avoided certain fights, but you can't just be this complete career cherry picker and you fight guys like Lara and Golovkin and, overall Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders and Plant and Jacobs, and all these other guys, Mayweather, Bivol, Jamel Charlo, Jaime Munguia, I mean, the list just goes on and on. You can't be a quote unquote career cherry picker and fight all those A-grade level names. It doesn't make any sense. And then on top of that, Canelo Alvarez, he can actually outscore certain guys because he has an exceptional level of talent and boxing IQ. Something that, so far, to be quite honest with you, Gervonta Tank Davis has not really quite shown. So it is what it is. So once again, say whatever you want to about any of those fighters that I just listed, but this has never, ever happened to someone like a Canelo or a Crawford or a Usyk or that of an Inoue. They've never been in a fight to where they debatably lost to a guy that had only 10 knockouts out of 25 wins. And then on top of that, that guy had already lost to a guy in Jamel Herring a few fights ago. So he was looked at as a B grade level fighter heading into this fight. It's never happened. Ever. Never to them. So before we start comparing Gervonta Tank Davis to those names, he really has to prove himself, and he has to prove himself a lot. That's just the way that it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I just thought that I would talk about that. Pretty much peace out for now. I just thought that I would talk about that. But I don't want to hear any more talks about Gervonta Davis being top 5 pound for pound. Not after this, until he ends up proving himself against a guy like Shakur, Devin Haney, Teofimo Lopez, or Lomachenko. That's the only way, in my view, that he's going to crack the top 5. Period. Is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see where this goes.